they can't find men who are maybe more conservative. Usually they're looking for somebody who is religious, like a lot of conservative women tend to be God loving conservatives. And they can't find a lot of young men who want to marry a working woman now. And this is an actual problem that's coming up on the right. And to me, it's so sad because it's like, how did we...
It's sad? Why is that sad? Can you imagine culmination of the right wing, which banks on Christian ethics for the entire purview of its base, saying that it's sad that men want to live inside of those ethical purviews. They want their wife to stay at home and look after their children and teach their children and help their children, rather than outsource that to... That's sad. Why don't they care about our careers? That's not what you're here for. You're not here for your career. There's nothing more important that you can do. And by the way, if you're super smart and you're a brilliant woman who could be a scientist, best thing you can do still is to reproduce. Why would we not want your genes to be reproduced? If you're brilliant, we want brilliant children, right? So reproduction is another, for brilliant women who can do this, right? That's even better. Even better. The whole culmination of this is like, why would you punish women who want to be working girls? Like, because it's at the expense of the other thing, which is so important to us, which is our reproduction, the replication of legacy. Your children are your legacy. They're what you leave behind in the world that keeps your genes left in the world. Even J.F. Gary Epi completely concedes that this is true. In fact, I think he makes the argument in his own way often. It is the legacy that's left behind. It's the only way that, my grandpa still lives through me. His genes are still very much alive inside of me. And his grandfather before him and his grandfather before him. You have lines going back, thousands of years just being completely eliminated. So that you can get some praise from your boss because you got the TPS report done on time. That seems really counterintuitive and very stupid. It seems very stupid. And she's like, it's a big problem. Well, yeah, the big problem is that you want to have it all. Want to have a big career and have a family and have well-adjusted kids. And you can't have it all. It's not possible. And even if it was for some vague few, it ain't going to be possible for almost anybody else on planet Earth.
Get to the point where we're now telling young, conservative, amazing women that they're not attractive if they also work. If they choose to, let's say, do what I'm doing and what you're doing and get their voice out there. But I'll stick with me just because I think conservatives listening to this will like the thought of another Megyn Kelly voice up and coming. Well, why wouldn't we want that? Why would we take somebody who's talented in this field and really wants to make a difference and have the messaging to her be, you're really not that valuable unless you give it up and go into the home and only have a family and only raise a family. And not only are we sending her that message, but young men are actually believing that. They're actually...
Yes, young men actually have their own preferences. They prefer not to have any sort of outsourcing for their children's care, but would rather that the mate they selected for care for their children and They don't outsource that to complete strangers because they're not stupid. What I've witnessed about most women is that they have a limited ability to self-reflect. They can't own up to the fact their choices are harming society. It's all deflection and justification. Well, it's your fault. It's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. Yeah, right. You can work later when your children are grown if you really want to. Also, you can have a part-time job or things like that to assist your household, even times where you may have to have a full-time job to assist your household. But the idea that men can't have a preference that they want their wife to stay home and take care of children, knowing full well that that's going to give them the most well-adjusted children. That's what we got. What are the things that can be the best reflection of the character of a man? Often it's what he puts out in the world. He can do this a few different ways. One way is what he builds. That's one way. Another way is the reflection of his children. That's another way. It is part of the legacy of men. Always. If you go into, let me give you an easy example. You ever gone into a restaurant where there's a mom and a dad who are sitting there and they have a few kids and the kids are crawling all over the place. They're knocking over and they're yelling, you know what I mean? And they're just pricks, you know what I mean? I think everybody's experienced that. And the second you see it, right, you think of it as a reflection of the parents, rightly so. That behavior is a reflection of the parents, rightly so. That was due to a failure of the parents, rightly so. Rightly so. Now, I always prided myself in the fact that and it's not that kids aren't going to make mistakes or do stupid shit. They are. All kids do this. Okay, all kids do dumbass things, you know what I mean? But I always prided myself on the fact that if I was in a restaurant, I had my children with me, their hands were folded, right? They would talk, but they would speak quietly. They wouldn't be disturbing other guests who were in the restaurant, right? They wouldn't be a problem for anybody. When I was a young man, when I was a kid, if I got loud in a restaurant, my dad would reach over and smack me across the mouth. And then he would say something and it would sound like this: "Shut your mouth." And I did. And I did. That was about what it looked like. I'd get mouthy, and then he'd smack me across my stupid mouth. I used to chew with my mouth open, you know, when I was a little kid. My dad would reach over and he'd flick my bottom lip as hard as he could. That shit hurt. He said, "Close your mouth." Okay. Right? He didn't put up with no. Didn't put up with no. And what he would say is he would say, "Look, people don't want to come into this restaurant and hear you. And I don't want to come into this restaurant and hear you either." I don't want to hear you either. The treat is that you're in a restaurant and you're getting restaurant food and you get to go out. You know what I mean? You get to go out. That's the treat for you, kid. The treat for us is that you shut your mouth. And the treat for other people who are coming in the restaurant is that they can see that there's well-adjusted children who are sitting here, right, who are not acting out of turn and being pricks. That's the whole point. And it's like, this idea that a lot of these behavioral problems don't end up happening, especially these kind of ultra behavioral problems don't happen because of the outsourcing, is insane. Of course it does. Of course it does. You outsource the raising to public schools. You outsource the raising of your children to complete strangers. And that's not to say that there won't be failures. from even parents who do homeschooling and things like, of course there are, but it's vastly, vastly superior to the alternative. You think of a couple who has a kid who's a problematic kid, right? Think about how much more problematic they would have been if you had outsourced them to a stranger. It would have been 10 times worse if you had outsourced it. Now it's like, look, my old man was 100% right. He was 100% right, and I did need to shut my mouth. And I did need to chew with my mouth closed. And people weren't there to listen to me. They weren't there to hear me shriek or act like an asshole or carry on or any of that. That's not what they were there for. They were there to enjoy a nice meal, right, where they could hear quiet conversation with whoever else was at their table. He was totally right. While it's all good and dandy to have a stay-at-home wife take care of the kids, how do we get past the economy is set up for two-income households? The single-income household is dead. No, that's a materialist argument. It's a materialist argument. Look, you're not telling me nothing about how tough it is on a single income to raise a family. I did it for years. And there was occasions we got behind. My wife had to go back and work part-time. She'd work for a few months so we could get caught back up, things like that. There were sacrifices that had to be made from time to time. But mostly what we did was we cut out vacations, totally cut out vacations. We never really took any. Well, not really. We just never took any. We never took vacations. We never really went anywhere. We didn't go out very much, right? We didn't do any of those things. We cut way back on all of those expenses, and they add up in a big way. It came down to the necessities were what mattered more than anything else. But you can't replace that. When I look back, for instance, to when I was a kid, I don't really remember any of the toys and that I got when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. I don't remember any of that stuff. We lived in really small places because my parents didn't do very well for most of their life until they got much older. And I don't really remember it being very bad to be inside of, a not so spacious, house and things like that. It wasn't very bad on us. It really wasn't. I always remember that my mom wanted to make sure I was clean, and she always wanted to make sure I was taken care of, and so did my dad. You know what I mean? They wanted to make sure of those things. But any of the like extras, the toys and the this and the that, I barely remember that stuff. What I do remember is that my parents cared a lot about me, and they sure loved me, and they definitely made sure that I was kept in line where I needed to be. That's what mattered. You know what I mean? You're supposed to give up a lot of the conditions of like material wants when you have children. That's what you're supposed to do. It's not all about you anymore. It's about the next generation. It's about your kids.